How's everybody doing today? This is Antonio Moore coming to you from Tone Talks. I appreciate you guys tuning in today. I wanted to have a brief discussion about black love, and I've had a couple of them about relationships, but I wanted to kind of dig a little bit deeper in terms of the application of some of the wealth data that I've shared with you and how I see it playing out in black relationships. I think for so many of us, we're really living in amidst a time where so much of black love is existing without any of the stability required for relationships to exist, and we don't even know it. We don't really know the social position of African Americans in this country. The wealth positions, we look at earnings over wealth, and we don't understand that we're competing in an open market with a white America that does have a lot of wealth. They have 90% of the household wealth. There's $94 trillion of it. In this video, I don't want to focus as much on data as I focus on just the impact of that data as I see it, and how we can actually resolve and solve some of the smaller things that we have in our control as we move forward. I do have to lay out some brief data to kind of help those people who haven't seen the prior videos to understand where I'm coming from. And where I'm coming from is a place that really deals with the impact of white America having 90% of the household wealth, $94 trillion, and black America having 2.6%. But the larger problem isn't just that we have 2.6%. It's that when you lay that 2.6% out as I show you right here, what you see is that the top 20% of black America has 90% of that. Our families, our young families, our working age families are largely living on no wealth. The bottom half of black America is worth negative $60 billion. And I think for a lot of us, we don't understand what it means that the middle black family in America is worth $1,700 without the family car, because we just see that as a figurative, as a number. But what it is more a marker of instability. It's a marker of a society where African Americans are largely pushed into situations where you can't afford your children, so then you abjugate, you give up, you don't follow through with the things that you're supposed to do as, say, a father. It's a world where, as a mother, you have to choose between unhealthy food and no food at all, because the healthy option is so much more expensive. It's a world where African Americans are basically, after hundreds of years of enslavement and incarceration and mass and Jim Crow, are left with options of choosing between bad and worse. And I feel like for a lot of us, the way that we've resolved and dealt with that, so many of us, the way we've dealt with that is to be emotionally reckless with one another. When I say emotional recklessness, what I'm looking at is the way that we've come to use each other to fill the stopgaps of our lack of wealth. Whether it be dates with no intention of ever mating, for men and women, but particularly when you look at young women, you have a guy who clearly is using his last dime to go on this date, and you could basically hide behind the reality that he chose this date, or you can be honest that I have no intention on ever being with you as a mate, so then maybe I shouldn't take this date. Or whether it be a guy who's laying with the woman he has no intention of having a long-term relationship with, and she's made clear that that's what she wants out of it, and him being clear with her that that's not where he's going. I think for a lot of us, the coping mechanism has been to use one another recklessly in some ways, as a way to deal with all the emotional pain that comes from the lack of. And I feel like, for a lot of us, the reality of what it means to say that the middle black family is worth $1,700 is kind of lost. What I'm saying to you is that 7 out of 14 million black homes, there's 14 million black homes in the whole country, 7 million have less than $1,700 in worth when you add everything up. 7 million. And I'm saying somewhere around probably about 10 or 11 million are worth less than $10,000 likely. And what that means in terms of projections is that much of what young black families project their future to be has no grounding in the reality of their financial state today, or where America is projecting it's allowing or creating space for their future to be tomorrow. So that is a recipe for emotional instability. And the answer can't be just to be reckless to one another. as the stopgap. You know, in a world of short-term Tinder dating, you know, you see this world where you create extensive relationships with people over a short term, and then you turn around and then cut it off based on the pretense of, well, I'm back with the person that I was with before I met you, or I'm just having me time. What you don't see is the consequence that has not only on the other person but also on yourself in terms of valuing boundaries. That is emotionally reckless. I think we've reached a point where people around us don't even check that recklessness. They don't check it. They actually celebrate it in some ways. You know, the answer to a lack of black wealth can't be essentially to become more and more self-interested. You know, what I believe needs to happen is that the answer to lack of black wealth, what it needs to be is more collective. And inside of being more collective, you have to be more honest with yourself about what you can and can't give. Now, that's a hard thing to do in a world where there is no wealth, and also culturally, due to a lot of things that are beyond our control, there aren't as many like lessons of who and what and how you should treat people, who you should be, what you should expect, how you should treat others. We're seeing all kind of indicators of what I'm saying. I mean, we're seeing dinner dates without intent. We're seeing texting without boundaries. We're seeing love without security. And the thing that's such a trip is that I think what it's leaving in its wake is a bunch of broken people that started off already unhinged. What I am saying is that for us to actually combat that, what we have to do is sit down, come up with collective answers, and be collectively responsible to others and ourselves in terms of love. I think personally it's reckless to get someone invested emotionally in a possible relationship with you when you have no intent, and then essentially pull the rug out from under them. And then somebody would say, well, how else do you get to know someone? With boundaries. And I think for a lot of people in this new era of short text back and forth, of lack of conversation, of use without consequence, what happens is that they don't know that they use people until someone uses them. And for me, I think one of the solutions to addressing this is a real honesty about the state of black America, state of black wealth, and where that comes from. Now, that requires you to get honest with your lineage, your immediate current family, and yourself about what you've done in this lifetime. And those are three things that are a whole nother level of analysis for a lot of people. We're of the generation where so many people don't go past their great grandparents. And that isn't necessarily just by choice, that is structural. Because of a legacy of oppression, slavery, Jim Crow, and a number of other things. But what I am saying is that despite all of that, the answer that we can start acting on is to be less reckless amongst it all. Be honest with who and what you want to be. Be honest about where you're going. Be honest about what you have and what you don't have. And share that honesty with someone else when the time fits. You don't have to hide anything from anyone. So I kind of just wanted to come to you today and have a brief discussion about like this recklessness emotionally that I'm seeing in our race. Because what I'm seeing our race do to answer the lack of wealth is to become more cutthroat with each other. And that isn't healthy going forward. We got a road to go as we start seeing wealth calcified. And if what I'm saying is a sign of what's coming in the future, it's not going to be nothing nice. I said this in a prior video, but for single black women, for first-time marriages for single black women result in divorce 70% of the time. And I don't see that doing nothing but going higher with all of the wealth indicators. I'm pulling up a chart, and you can see on this chart that black females actually have better marriage rates than white women until 1970. Only 5% of black women ages 35 and above had never been married. 1970 and prior. You can see that on this chart. Whereas it was around 10% for white women. In 1970, something pivotal happened, and I believe a lot of it hinged around mass incarceration. The uptick in the amount of black men that went to prison for innocuous small crimes. You can see the same thing if I pull up a chart for black men in terms of having better marriage rates than white men up until around 1960. So, like, what we have to understand when we start being reckless towards one another is the systemic realities of why this happens, and that's what will ground us and actually allow us to have better and more healthy relationships, knowing the data. So I also just wanted to briefly talk about some statistics. I'm gonna pull up a couple charts because I think it's necessary to have stats about relationships that people may have never seen before. This is from blackdemographics.com, and what it shows is that in 2014, only 29% of African Americans were married, compared to 48% of all Americans. Half, or 50% of African Americans, have never been married, compared to 33% of all Americans. So, like, we're not getting married at the same rate. So I believe a lot of that has to do with things that go all the way back to slavery, and much of it also has to do with the lack of stability that comes from the lack of wealth that I showed earlier. But when we look down at, many of the myths around that is like black men are marrying white women, and that's part of the reason. And it's just not supported by the stats. In 2014, only 14% of black men were married to non-black women. That includes all groups, Latinos, Asians, whatever. And only 14% of black men were married to non-black women, which is up from 11% in 2010. Only half of these non-black women were white. As a matter of fact, the Pew Research Center released a report finding that 25% of black male newlyweds in 2013 married non-black women, compared to 12% of black women who married out. So they are marrying out at a higher rate than black women, but it isn't the ratio, I think, that explains the extreme lack of marriage overall. When we look at black marriage in 2014, 86% of black men have a black wife. When we look, 94% of black women have a black husband. I mean, what you see is largely we do marry each other. The question is, how do we make these marriages have stability? How do we move past a state of having like this emotional recklessness, basically cause us to start these marriages up possibly on bad foundation, and then also end them with so much like anger, frustration, and other things. Some of the other charts and stats that I saw about black marriage is, there's a great chart that I have that how the war on drugs affected black marriage, and you can just see the data laid out in this chart about how black marriage just got impacted by mass incarceration. I'm pulling that chart up now, and what you see is the extreme number of black men in prison, which rose to like 500, almost 600,000. Rose to almost 600,000 in prison in 2000. To put that in context, there might have been 50 or 60,000 black women in prison at the same time. When you start dealing with that total like lack of men, that isn't even adding in the ones that died as a result of gang violence and other things in the streets. Total lack of black men in the dating pool. How does this all play out? And so, like, for a lot of us, what I'm seeing is that our answer to this has been to create another narrative. The other thing that I saw that I wanted to kind of pull up was this great analysis. It said, although 48% of black women have never been married, 46% of all women are currently married. Only 26% of black women are currently married, while only 30% of all women in America have never been married. Black women are also less likely to be separated from their spouses compared to all women at 9%, but are much more likely to be divorced at 13% compared to 3%. Black women are less likely to be married than black men. As a matter of fact, there are about 364,000 more black men who are married than black women, even though black women are 51% of the population. So what I'm bringing all the stats up to say is that we're seeing the data from wealth show an impact in terms of relationships. We're seeing the consequence of history show an impact on relationships, and our question has to be, how do we challenge that? How do we demand that the government incentivize through taxes, through education, through all kind of incentives to create an avenue where we actually have stable relationships? How do we ourselves take out the emotional instability, the emotional recklessness, to make a comfortable environment for males and females to be around us, whatever your choice is? And I think a lot of that starts with honesty. It starts with a real acceptance of who and what you are, where you come from. And I think for so many of us, we start off with who I want to be rather than who I am. And that ain't nothing but emotional recklessness in a bottle, waiting to happen. The solution has to be a much more honest exchange between males and females about what's going on in their lives, and the space to do that without judgment. And I think for a lot of us, that space is something we're not socialized to give. Because once we see a flaw, a social issue, we're taught to tuck tail and run rather than confront it, and actually explain to that person what's going on. That's what I wanted to talk about. Let's become less emotionally reckless. Let's start dealing with the fact that we have all these social tools to interact more responsibly and move forward together.